A few months ago, Jordan Peterson made the following tweet about the cover of a Sports Illustrated magazine that featured a fat woman Yumi Nu on its cover. Sorry, not beautiful, and no amount of authoritarian tolerance is going to change that. And on first pass, this tweet simply makes no sense at all. For one thing, it's obviously a complete nothing burger, a non-controversy he's getting absurdly upset about. The reality is, fat women exist. There are a lot of them. Their being present on some magazine selling swimsuits is really just a completely normal thing. And even if we accept that Sports Illustrated, for some reason, should only cater to horny men who want to see hot ladies, it is still a wildly stupid thing to get mad at. I don't know how to break this to you, but many men date fat women. They marry them, they have kids with them, they have sex with them, and yes, they enjoy this fact. They fantasize about it and like the idea of doing it more. Why then do we have to pretend this is not the case? Who does it serve? Maybe more important to this tweet, though, is that it is just literal gibberish. Authoritarian tolerance? What are you talking about? What authority is trying to make you find this woman beautiful, Jordan? Who is forcing your hand? Does the mere presence of an image you're not horny about qualify as authoritarianism? And if so, how exactly do you want me to deal with that? No, this tweet is just pseudo-intellectual word salad, right? Jordan wants to be petty. He wants to object to a completely inoffensive image, call a random woman he doesn't know ugly, and masquerade it as some kind of beautiful, virtuous act protecting our culture. And by the end of this video, you will understand that this gesture is at the core of Jordan Peterson's politics. Hey everybody, let's talk about a lecture that Jordan Peterson gave about IQ in 2017. And, let's just start it off with an outline of the points he makes. Peterson begins the lecture with a general defense of IQ, or intelligence quotients. He says that IQ tests and their results are the best researched and most robust statistics in psychology, that it is very predictive of success on a wide range of metrics, and that denying its validity is ridiculous.
If you don't buy IQ research, you might as well throw away all the rest of psychology.
He then goes down a chart, connecting what your IQ is to what job might be right for you. If you're 130, you can become a lawyer. If you're 120, you can write ads, so on and so forth. Then, and this is the spicy part, he ends the list here. Below an 85 IQ, there are simply very, very few jobs a person can do.
Under 87, is there something? Well, no. Jobs for people with IQs of less than 85 are very, very rare.
He ends the lecture by affirming his point, claiming it's an extremely nasty and relevant problem, and that we need to discuss it more, even as it might be politically incorrect or unpleasant.
That's a big problem, and it's something our society has not addressed at all.
This video, for better and for worse, is not about brain science. I'm certainly not an expert in psychometrics and have no interest in presenting myself as one. While I did do some research into this subject for the sake of this video, it's a topic I find pretty boring, and I'm sure other people could do a better job of it than I could. But in the end, that's kind of what interests me about this whole situation. Nothing about this particular Jordan Peterson lecture is unique. He has made all of these points multiple times. He always affirms the efficacy and reliability of IQ. He always talks about how the bottom 10 to 15% of the population is too stupid to be a productive asset to society. And he always ends the talk by saying something about the incredible importance of this issue, how it presents a difficult and huge problem which has been systematically ignored by a culture that just doesn't like the science.
And the fact that neither side of the political perspective will take a good, cold, hard look at this problem means that we're going to increasingly have a structural problem in our societies. It's a vicious problem, man. And so
It's hard to train people to become creative, adaptive, problem solvers.
it's impossible. In a complex society like ours, and one that's becoming increasingly complex, there isn't anything for 10% of the population to do. All right, well, what are we going to do? Are we going to ignore that? We're going to run away from that?
Well, I don't have a solution to that, but I at least can point out the problem.
And it's this last point that I want to focus on today. See, Peterson's enduring, almost repetitive takes on IQ are not merely those of a scientist trying to assess statistical data, but those of a political actor who wants to direct society in more optimal ways. And the question on the table is, how? What exactly does he think we're gonna get out of this conversation? What's the point here, the desired end goal of the argument? Why is Jordan Peterson so interested in this particular IQ conversation? In a lecture delivered around 10 years ago, Jordan Peterson talks about symbolism among ancient populations. In particular, he zooms in on a helix pattern you can see across cultures. And in what amounts to a kind of aside, Peterson says this.
I think that's I really do believe this, although it's very complicated to explain why. I really believe that's a representation of DNA. So
now, to Jordan Peterson's credit, I have no idea what he's talking about. He says that these early societies were representing DNA strands, but that the reason why he thinks that is complicated, and to my knowledge, he's never given that complicated reason. So maybe he doesn't mean what it seems like he means, or maybe his argument would rock my world. Who knows? Still, it's hard for me to imagine that Peterson could give plausible reasons to hold this belief. To suggest that people before microscopes had some awareness of the microscopic structures inside their bodies doesn't make any sense. How would that even work? Why would they know such a thing? And besides, real, actual snakes curl around each other when mating, and it looks exactly like the art that Peterson shows. Isn't that a more plausible explanation of where people got this image? No, this sentence from Peterson just reads like mysticism to me. A belief in a kind of spiritual eye in the subconscious of man, aware of deep realities that the senses cannot access. And I don't buy it here because I don't think we have good reason to buy it. Still, there's something tempting, almost satisfying about this belief, I think. For Peterson in this moment, society does not merely exist. It is not just a complicated, messy series of connections and beliefs and materials that make up the social world we live in. No, society has a source, and its source, quite literally, is the body. The parts within us are on the outside, and they always have been. Our guts order reality, and they do a perfect job. Okay, what is Jordan Peterson's IQ argument doing? If we blur our eyes, what is the main thing he seems to be talking about? Well, I think it's pretty simple. Peterson is here trying to give us one major reason why wealth is so stratified in our society. Poverty in the United States tends to hover from around 11 to 15%, and many more Americans than that live with low incomes. That's a pretty shocking number, right? One that requires explanation. So Peterson comes in and says, you know what? 10 to 15% of people just aren't smart enough to be productive.
Under 87, is there something? Well, no.
And doesn't that add some clarity to this picture? Wouldn't those slow people be astronomically more likely to be very poor, and couldn't this problem get worse over time? I'm not just making this connection up, by the way. Peterson says it explicitly.
The relationship between poverty and intelligence is self-evident if you're willing to think it through for any length of time.
There's something elegant to this theory, isn't there? Peterson here produces a psychological model and maps it onto the world in this very convenient seeming way. But in the end, when you actually look at his perspective on IQ, the conversations he wants so badly to have about it, and the way he justifies those conversations, problems start to emerge in his logic. Let's just jump in with an example. What you're about to see is one of the only times Peterson uses his thoughts on IQ to make real, concrete policy suggestions.
There's no place in our cognitively complex society for 1 in 10 people. So what are we going to do about that? The answer is no one knows. You say, well, shovel money down the hierarchy. It's like the problem isn't lack of money. I mean, sometimes that's the problem, but the problem is rarely absolute poverty. It's rarely that. It is sometimes, but rarely. It's not that easy to move money down the hierarchy. So first of all, it's not that easy to manage money. So It's a vicious problem, man.
Okay, one point that Peterson's making there is that people, the bottom 10% of IQ scores he's so concerned with, aren't easy to give money to. And that's because they're so stupid that they can't figure out how to deal with the money that they're given. That seems pretty straightforward, right? IQ is relevant to us because it has this implication on wealth redistribution. So how do I respond to this point? Well, the issue here is that Peterson's claim just isn't helpful to anything. It doesn't provide any actual value. Look, money is complicated. The economy is complicated. And if you wanted to ask the question, what is the best way to redistribute wealth, we would have to look carefully at those things and come to the conclusions we think are best based on evidence and based on what we think is right. We know that poverty is not some stable, intractable law of society because different places have different policies and, as a result, different amounts of wealth disparity. We know that relieving people of poverty allows them to live better lives. In fact, an interesting study indicates that poverty does incredible damage to brain performance. We know that there are good ways to help poor people have more money because of course there are. And so we can make choices, do things, and at no point in this discussion does some ridiculous conjecture about the stupidity of poor people actually help anything. Peterson's appeal to IQ might look scientific, but it doesn't give us anything that the real world does not. This is Jordan Peterson selling his merchandise too hard, acting like it does things, provides things that it simply doesn't. And this kind of overselling of the value of IQ can be found in another interesting thing that Peterson sometimes says, and I'll play it now.
The conservatives will say, well, they should just work harder. It's like, sorry, that ain't going to fly. And the liberals will say, well, there's no difference between people anyhow, and you can just train people to do everything, and that's wrong. So they're both wrong.
So this statement doesn't make any normative claim, doesn't call for one political solution over another, but it does try to make IQ seem really useful. Both of these sides, the liberals and the conservatives, are bad because they don't take into account the importance of IQ. To the right, he says a lot of people are not capable of picking themselves up by their bootstraps because they're too dumb. And to the liberal, he says that just providing people with sufficient training won't make society equitable because people are too dumb. It seems like we have a home run here, right? People just too stupid. People too dumb. Great. So there's a problem with this argument, and it's kind of a subtle one. Simply put, I don't agree with either the conservative or the liberal in Peterson's little speech here, and IQ is neither necessary nor often helpful to see why they're both bad positions. Take the conservative mantra, if you just work hard enough, you can succeed. This claim is idiotic on its face. Even if picking yourself up by your bootstraps was a reasonable way to get out of poverty, it would still be a meaningless thing to say because we are not living in a society where everyone's bootstraps are pulled. Some people are poor. That is an objective reality. A conservative who makes this point isn't actually providing a way for poor people to succeed, giving real insight into anything. No, they're just absconding political responsibility in the most banal way possible, saying that it's not their job to help you. And people having different IQs doesn't rebut that point at all, right? It's actually fairly common to believe both that some people are born better, more gifted, more deserving than others, and that everyone is ultimately responsible only for their own lot in life. That's kind of a central conservative position, in fact. At any rate, Peterson's liberal perspective is also pretty bad. The claim that we can train anyone to do anything is, to be fair, a whole lot better than the conservatives' pick yourself up by your bootstraps. At least it implies you actively want to make society better for people, but it once again leaves a lot to be desired, and for reasons that have nothing to do with IQ. For one, it bases politics on a yet unverified conclusion. Why does this liberal believe that simply educating people into professional positions will make society sufficiently equitable? Why would it? The job market doesn't possess infinite high-paying jobs, right? Lots of jobs need doing that pay poorly and don't require much training, and it's entirely unclear how the future will change this. Besides, if you don't resolve poverty, then people will still obviously obviously be advantaged or disadvantaged by their class position, no matter how good their teachers are. Don't get me wrong, I am very pro-education. I think that learning things helps people. I just don't see it as the be-all and end-all, the only change that we should depend on. And this leads me to the bigger problem I have with the liberal here, which is that their position is just kind of fart-smelling. Instead of saying that we should help make the world a better place for the people living in it, they just hypothesize about some future state where all these issues work themselves out because of the state of education. It's a cowardly political position, and one that feels like it intentionally dismisses the needs of real people who have real issues. See, Jordan Peterson is trying to make IQ science look really important by acting like it produces a new, better politics for us, a politics that avoids the pitfalls of liberalism and conservatism. But the truth is, it doesn't do anything like that. Peterson's just saying two bad ideas and then attaching IQ to the possibility of better ones in a way that doesn't make any sense. It's a parlor trick, plain and simple. For all he talks about it, Jordan Peterson has a very hard time explaining what IQ is actually supposed to do, how it's going to help us. Let's talk about a lecture that Jordan Peterson gave around a year ago.
Free speech as a precondition for mental and social health.
It's about the goodness and importance of free speech, and in one section, about 10 minutes in, to demonstrate his point, he starts talking about personal relationships.
Listening, that's a hard thing. Why? Because sometimes you hear things you don't want to hear. And you can't make light of that.
As he says, a person fighting with their significant other might, on some level, not want to listen to them. To listen to them, to internalize their words and understand them completely can be scary, challenging. It can lead you to the conclusion that you are wrong, that you are not as good a person as you thought you were. Peterson goes on to say that the best predictor of a marriage failure is one partner rolling their eyes, ignoring and dismissing the words of their partner.
The best predictor of divorce, if you're a couples counselor, is eye rolling. And that's disgust. And once the relationship is degenerated because of lack of communication, perhaps, malevolence, perhaps, ignorance, and there's nothing left but disgust, there's nothing left of the relationship.
It's obvious to see how Peterson implicitly connects this to society writ large. We have an obligation to respect the words of the other, not roll our eyes, because otherwise, like this couple, society will fall apart. Free speech doesn't just describe a good law then, but also an ethical responsibility to hear people out under the assumption that they might have something worthwhile to say. That's how I read this section anyway, and I think it's a charitable reading, especially because Jordan Peterson has said almost exactly this at other points.
Because if you listen to someone who disagrees with you, and you really listen, they're going to tell you things that will reveal your errors and make you change. And so that was another barrier to listening, is you don't want the person to reveal themselves and their complexity to some degree because they shake you to the depths of your core certainties.
Now, to be clear, I am pro the concept of being challenged. What's more, I think free speech in a legal sense is a good thing. Still, I have a few problems with Jordan's choice of rhetoric here. First, and this might be obvious, there's a big difference between a romantic couple and society as a whole. Namely, that sometimes romantic relationships end. Not only that, it can be a good thing when they end. Sure, I agree that dismissing your partner, feeling disgusted by them, rolling your eyes is not a good omen for your relationship, but sometimes relationships shouldn't have good omens. In this way, this couple in Jordan Peterson's lecture works to harm his overall argument, because they are a clear case where not all challenges are good, not all speech worthy of internalizing, not from a romantic partner, and perhaps by proxy, not from a political pundit. Second, and perhaps more importantly, I'm interested in where Peterson locates the problem in this struggling relationship. He seems to center the issue on dismissal, the moment where communication breaks down, but that's odd, isn't it? Hey, another bus is coming by! Can I hear it for the buses? If a healthy civic structure or relationship demands mutual respect, demands that we internalize and confront the other, and to some extent I agree it does, then the social obligation is not just on the person listening, but also on the person speaking. You have a moral obligation to express ideas that are worthy of consideration, not to say things that are idiotic, needlessly offensive, or ridiculous. And if you do say something that merits no respect, I'd think that you be to blame when you don't get any respect. To me, that's a relationship. That's society. In the end, what I find interesting here is that I could use this example of the fighting couple to make any point I wanted about society as a whole. We must always listen when someone expresses an argument to us. We should sometimes ignore people when they do that. A relationship must continue on the basis of mutual respect. Sometimes mutual respect isn't earned. You should never roll your eyes. You should sometimes roll your eyes. It is all obviously contingent on the nature of the relationship, the words being said. As such, this example communicates nothing about the way society ought to be organized, how to deal with speech we don't like. It doesn't actually do anything, but we talk about it anyway. Listening to my video a few moments ago, I imagine a few of you might think I'm playing what amounts to word games. Sure, you might say, Jordan Peterson has trouble demonstrating the helpfulness of IQ as a political tool, but the facts remain, don't they? Peterson believes a very large segment of the population is going to have trouble in life, have a hard time getting a job, making ends meet, etc. And if he's right about that, and he wants to address that issue, then isn't that a good thing? I think poverty is a huge problem that needs solving. He thinks poverty is a huge problem that needs solving. We're all in agreement here, even though we approach it from vastly different angles. In some ways, I think that is an appropriate rebuttal. After all, if Jordan Peterson was a champion for the poor who just so happened to be really invested in psychometrics, I probably wouldn't be making this video. I just wouldn't have enough interesting stuff to say, right? So here, we come to what is probably a more fundamental issue with Jordan Peterson's claims about IQ, and that is that within his moral universe, the problems he's raising cannot meaningfully be solved. Let's go back to something we already talked about. Jordan Peterson's belief that funneling money down the economic hierarchy is hard because poor people aren't good with finances. We have that clip from before, but he says this point a fair amount, actually. In one particularly lame moment, he says this.
You know, it's not like money is necessarily a good for everyone. It's hard to manage money. Well, I had clients who were, drug addicts, and the worst possible thing that could happen to them was that they got some money. One guy I remember in particular, every time he got his disability check, he was gone for 5 days. You usually found him in a ditch, because he'd just go to the bar, spend every cent he had on alcohol and cocaine, and wake up in a ditch, 3/4 dead, eventually completely dead. And, then he was ashamed and horrified and repentant, and he'd straighten himself out again, and then that was all well and good until, as long as he was broke, until the next check showed up, and then bang, the same thing. So, it's not like money is necessarily a good.
I met a drug addict one time, so I don't know, maybe poor people don't deserve money. Intense demon vibes. Profound demon aura on this clip. Anyway, there's something I find interesting about this point, which is that it seems to utterly ignore the state of political discourse in America, like the things people actually talk about. Here's a list of extremely common policy recommendations that are offered by progressives. Socialized healthcare, a huge increase in public housing, socialized and well-funded education, free school lunches, and other ways to assure that people are adequately fed, public transportation. I could go on here, of course, and I could go more in depth into each of these suggestions, but instead, let's just observe something about each of the items on that list. None of them give people resources that are easily squandered. You can't and won't give away your free house. You can't use public transportation to buy drugs. Socialized healthcare cannot meaningfully be frittered away. That's weird, isn't it? Here we have a list of policies that would unambiguously help poor people. According to Jordan Peterson, that means we'd also be helping the relevant people with low IQs. It's a solution that doesn't conflict with his poor people don't know how to spend money claim, and it seems like a win-win all around. And yet, he evaluates none of these ideas. And when it comes time to talk about the IQ discrepancy problem, he says it's super important, but that there's no good solution.
I don't have a solution to that, but I at least can point out the problem.
What's going on there? I'm a dumb little baby and I never have any idea what's happening, so... You know, I'm a bit confused. I'm just a dumb little guy. No, I'm just kidding. I was just pranking you before about not knowing what's going on. I'm extremely smart, actually. The reason Jordan is having an issue here is that he's a conservative, obviously. I initially had like 3 pages of text here expanding that point before I realized it was a fucking waste of your time. Now it's a bonus video. Enjoy my sewage, patrons. Peterson is broadly uninterested in discussing the possibility of solving systemic issues systematically, and he will almost always defer to some concept of personal development, fixing your own house, and rising to the best of your abilities in our meritocracy.
Because other people aren't the problem. You're the problem.
He doesn't think most poor people are gonna rise in that meritocracy, mostly because he thinks a lot of them are extremely fucking stupid. And he does think that's an issue in theory, but like, what's he gonna do about it? In one interview conducted by Dr. Oz 2 years ago, he says that from his perspective, the best way to resolve wealth inequality is for rich people to like, be cool and show that they're cool because a lot of them really are cool.
But again, I would say, from my perspective, the best way to address that is to put your own house in order. That means morally, means financially, to use your money wisely, not to use it to chase impulsive and reprehensible pleasures. It's also something that does your reputation no good and destabilizes society because it makes the rich look like parasites. And some people are parasitical, but many aren't.
A suggestion so vapid, so empty, so impossible to act on in any way that it almost feels like a parody of itself. My point being, Jordan Peterson basically likes things the way they are and isn't interested in talking about much else. I remember one special interview where people ask him the following question about IQ and poor people.
As you say, the systems that they try to apply in order to address that don't work and don't make any sense and create terrible outcomes. So where is the golden middle?
And Peterson responds like this.
Look, the reason that I'm an advocate of free speech is that the golden middle moves. And so how do we find it? Well, we talk about it. Where is it? It moves all the time.
Jordan, we all know about democracy and free speech. We know that society at large talks about issues. The boys here are asking what policies you like, what your opinion is. But of course, he doesn't have an answer. He has nothing to say on the subject because he doesn't want to have anything to say. It's not complicated. Around 3 months ago, Dr. Lisa Feldman Barrett released an article on Scientific American called Expressions Do Not Reveal Emotions. A month and a half later, Jordan Peterson released the following tweet about it. Darwin was wrong, but some random columnist for Scientific American is right? Probability 0. More woke idiocy and thinly veiled Marxist criticism of essentialism masquerading as enlightened science. So there's a bunch of things we could say about this. For one, the patronizing tone that Jordan Peterson uses here. Lisa Barrett is not some random columnist. She is one of the most prestigious and cited academics working in the field of effective science. What could possibly justify this kind of arrogance on Peterson's part here? Second, yes, the article disagrees with Charles Darwin on a nuanced subject, but why is Peterson so scandalized about the idea that Darwin could be wrong about something? I'm not trying to throw shade at Charles here. He was obviously brilliant, but he was also born more than 200 years ago, and, you know, he's just a dude. Darwin was definitely wrong about some things. He thought that emotional imbalance could cause frizzy hair, that insects rub their legs together because they're afraid or angry. The point is that treating the words of Darwin as sacrosanct and those who disagree with him as blasphemers is not science, but its opposite, and the way that Peterson is acting is truly embarrassing in my opinion. But the thing that interests me more than anything in this tweet is, why is Jordan Peterson so mad? What exactly is he reacting to here? I mean, Lisa Barrett's article is pretty innocuous. It makes a very normal point, I think. It is broadly assumed that the facial expressions people make each have a singular biological origin, that they align with discrete emotions. When you frown, it's because that's the way the body expresses sadness. When you smile, it's the way the body expresses happiness, etc. This is what Darwin claimed, and Barrett thinks he's wrong about it. As she claims, facial expressions are complicated. People can smile maliciously out of anger, frown when they're thinking hard or need to poop. Expressions can change based on culture, based on environment, based on situation. And this, Barrett says, is particularly important now because new face-analyzing AI technology is currently emerging. Machines that attempt to assess general attitude or friendliness or trustworthiness from the look on someone's face. And if facial expressions can't actually give us the whole picture about someone's inner world, that could be a big problem. So looking at this, we kind of have to ask, who cares? Like, it's an interesting enough article, don't get me wrong, but what's the big deal? How is it woke? How is it Marxist? It's not like Peterson provides any kind of rebuttal here, so his vitriol at this is absolutely baffling. But when you think about it, it makes sense, doesn't it? Makes sense that he'd be upset. In a way, I think it's the same kind of terror that a geocentrist might feel upon seeing evidence for a heliocentric solar system. If a smile is not a smile, if a frown can mean many things, if there is no concrete, biological, essential character to an expression, then how do we know it means anything? How can the human body be said to have a particular, unchanging purpose? If the universe doesn't revolve around us, then how can we belong anywhere? So I guess we come back to our question from the start, and with even fewer ideas now than we had before. If Jordan Peterson has such a difficult time identifying the value of IQ, if he seems fundamentally uninterested in solving whatever problems it represents, and if he has almost nothing to say about the subject in any case, then why are we talking about this in the first place? Why does he care so much? Why does he bring it up so often? And the answer is, because it's useful to him, because it is a culmination of the way he constructs the human body. Like facial expressions, our minds are easily read and largely cannot be changed. Like the eye roll from the unhappy wife, it informs how society ought to function. Like the double helix, which tells us that our insides are on the outside, IQ promises us that society is the way it is because the human body has made it so. It explains why the rich have so much, why the poor have so little. It largely explains racial disparity, something I didn't talk about in this video, but which Jordan Peterson clearly believes.
Yeah, well, the gender differences in IQ look relatively trivial, but there are differences in ethnicity that don't look trivial. The Ashkenazi Jews, for example, have on average a 15-point advantage over the rest of the Caucasian population.
And it explains all of these things not with the grotesque machinations of money and power, but with a simple peek at the inside of our skulls. But Peterson has an issue. Simply put, our bodies can't do that. They can't make politics for us. If you believe that people in our society deserve to be treated well and fairly, then Peterson's IQ disparity claim has no impact on that position whatsoever. And if you believe that society is largely good as is and that poor people don't matter all that much, IQ also has no impact on that belief. These things are choices we have to make. They do not emerge from us in some perfect, uncomplicated way. And so, Peterson does what any storyteller does when they have a conclusion they want you to come to. He changes his volume. The IQ problem is loud and explanatory. It takes up a lot of time, and he really cares about you agreeing with him about it. The solution, though, is quiet and unassuming. He can't say, "I don't care about poverty," so he just kind of waffles about. We should solve this problem, but that's hard, perhaps impossible to do. It's tricky to meddle with society, and in any case, the poor will simply have to wait. Recently, Jordan Peterson resigned his position as a tenured professor at the University of Toronto. Shortly after, he published an open letter explaining his reasons why, and in one section where he discusses his discontent with the state of academia, he writes this: "We're out to produce a generation of researchers utterly unqualified for the job, and we've seen what that means already in the horrible grievance studies disciplines. That, combined with the death of objective testing, has compromised the university so badly that it can hardly be overstated." There's something satisfying to me about this passage because, well, Peterson finally came through. He gave us an argument about the way society should be run, and he used IQ to do it. Why has academia gotten so bad? Because the low IQs have gotten in. We should discriminate against them more. It's actionable, it's precise, it has a stated outcome. Suddenly, when his purpose is to sort and segregate the world, to steepen the hierarchy, to get the stupid people out, it's all so easy. It almost makes you feel like that was his point all along. Jordan Peterson went on his daughter's podcast a few months ago and explained to her the problem he had with Yumi Nu's presence on the cover of Sports Illustrated. As he sees it, the whole thing is a lie, a cheap manipulation. His major point is that the magazine is essentially trying to pass an ugly person off as attractive.
The cover bothered me a lot because it was a cheap manipulation of something that had been working very well for Sports Illustrated. It was also an insistence that all of a sudden this non-athletic body type is as beautiful as the standard swimsuit model for Sports Illustrated. And it's not. It's not as athletic, and it's not as healthy, and that's that. And it's also not arbitrary, and so the whole thing is a lie.
This is not a hot lady, and Sports Illustrated wants us to believe otherwise. So I think this is preposterous, just deeply silly on its face. A magazine featuring a fat person when it normally features skinny people is not lying to you. Even if they got the most obviously ugly person to have ever lived on that cover, I wouldn't then look at it and say, "I've been had, why are you manipulating me like this?" And that's because, where's the deception? What bit of information could I wrongly believe about the world because I saw this image? That's the thing about the word lie, right? It implies the theoretical possibility of somebody believing something false. And in the case of Jordan Peterson and his little tweet, we can only conclude that what he's worried about is somebody getting duped into thinking that this woman is beautiful.
And it's also not arbitrary, and so the whole thing is a lie.
Frankly, I don't think we need Jordan Peterson's help with a thing like that. Speaking from personal experience, I've never been manipulated into seeing beauty where I don't. I'm not even sure such a thing is possible. But even if it is possible, it's hard to see the problem there. After all, if you manage to trick me into thinking somebody's pretty, then they are pretty. At least they are to me. But from Peterson's perspective, this is all a huge problem, a moral catastrophe. And honestly, I find that a bit funny. Jordan Peterson's politics center on the body, its essential character, the way it should shape the world, how it informs and necessitates our hierarchies. And yet, he is so afraid of one. A body like this cannot be trusted with us. It is in the wrong place, giving us the wrong thoughts. At the end of the day, even the body, especially the body, can lie. Thank you so much for watching this video. I really hope you enjoy it. This one took me just forever to make. It took so much time to the point where I have no idea if it even makes sense anymore. Like, I'm genuinely not sure when I sit down and watch it if any of the words I'm saying make even a basic amount of sense. But I hope that they do. If you did like it, feel free to like, comment, subscribe, and give me money on Patreon if you want to. There's a fun bonus video there that I mentioned where I talk about some things I didn't include in the final cut here. And on that note, it's time for my Patreon question of the video. I'll do 2 today because I hadn't made a video last week, so let's go. Mike Catcher asks, what's your favorite animated show that's come out in the past 10 years? So I actually don't think it's particularly close. Over the Garden Wall, full stop. Best animated show of the last 10 years. Probably second best animated show ever made. I mean, it's the best one. Of the last 10 years, clearly the best one. Infinity Train rocks, but it's not as good. And I also haven't watched maybe enough cartoons to make the definitive statement. Juten Kana asks, what will your post-apocalypse profession be? YouTube video essayist. Okay, bye.